The phone kept ringing and ringing and ringing. Nobody answered. We were somewhere between Nebraska and Iowa, cornfields on both sides as far as the eye could see, and the three of us, my dad, my mom, and I, sat in that car watching a name light up on the screen like we had all simultaneously forgotten how phones worked. My dad turned up the radio. My mom found something very interesting to look at, outside her window. And I sank deeper into my seat and stared at the ceiling. We left someone behind in Nebraska, and not one of us was in a hurry to explain ourselves. My name is Madeline Whitaker, Maddie for short, 24 years old, coffee food truck owner, and apparently the kind of person who leaves family members on a farm in the middle of nowhere and drives away without looking back. At least, that's how Betty would tell it. But Betty has always had a very creative relationship with the truth. And that right there is exactly where this story begins. To understand Betty, you first have to understand my family. My dad, Bill Whitaker, is the kind of man who has never once raised his voice in anger. Not once in his life. He is steady, warm, and so deeply patient that I genuinely used to wonder as a child if he was fully human. My mom, Vivian, is the balance to that. Sweet, nurturing, the kind of woman who makes everyone feel at home the moment they walk through her door. But do not let that softness fool you. Vivian Whitaker has a look, just one look, that will make you want to confess every wrong thing you have ever done in your entire life without her uttering a single word. They are old school in the most sincere way. Dinner at the table every night, church on Sundays, you respect this house, you contribute to this house, and you absolutely do not bring chaos through that front door. Those were the rules, simple, clear, and non-negotiable. And into that house came Betty. Bettina Whitaker arrived in our lives when she was 7 years old. Her father was my dad's younger brother, Gordon, a gentle, quiet man by all accounts. He passed away young, leaving behind a daughter whose mother had already disappeared not long after she was born, gone without a word and never once looked back. So my parents did what the Whitakers do. They opened the door, they made room at the table, they gave her a bedroom, the same last name on every form, and the same love they would give any child of their own. Betty grew up knowing exactly who Bill and Vivian were to her uncle and aunt who chose to raise her. They never hid that from her. They were honest, because they respected her enough to be. But they also made it clear every single day that she was wanted, she was loved, and she was home. For 3 years, Betty had that house and those people entirely to herself. And then I was born. I came into the world when Betty was 10 years old enough to understand exactly what was happening. Old enough to watch my mother's belly grow, to hear the excitement building in the house, to feel the energy shift in a way that a younger child never could have registered. And somewhere in that 10-year-old girl's mind, a mind already quietly carrying the weight of a mother who left and a father she barely got to know, something shifted the moment I arrived. Because now there was a real daughter, a biological child, someone who shared their blood in a way Betty never could. My parents never changed toward her, not even slightly. Betty still had her same seat at the table, her same place in every family photo, her same everything. They loved us both loudly and without condition, but you cannot always reason with a wound that formed before you were old enough to heal it. Betty decided somewhere deep down that my arrival was the beginning of her erasure. And no amount of love from my parents, and they gave her so much of it, was ever enough to convince her otherwise. Growing up, I adored her. She was my older sister, my protector, the coolest person in my world. I followed her everywhere. I wanted to be just like her. What I didn't know then was that every milestone of mine, every good thing that happened to me, was landing somewhere inside Betty like a quiet accusation. That the little girl who feared being replaced never really stopped being afraid. She just got older, and the fear got louder. By the time Betty was in her 30s, she had built very little of her own. No career she was serious about, no real independence, no drive to build anything from the ground up. She would pick up a job here and there, retail mostly, but nothing ever lasted long. Something was always wrong. The hours were too much, the manager was unfair, the coworkers were unbearable. There was always a reason to quit, always someone else to blame, and always my parents' home to fall back on when things fell apart. My parents never turned her away. They covered her phone bill, her car insurance, her personal shopping. They were patient in a way that honestly went beyond what most people would have endured, because at the end of the day, she was Gordon's daughter, and that meant something to my father that words cannot fully explain. But here was the thing. Nobody talked about out loud. Betty was 34 years old. 34. And she was still living like the rules of adulthood simply did not apply to her. While I was up before sunrise, running a business, budgeting every single dollar and contributing to the household, Betty was sleeping in, scrolling her phone and waiting for life to hand her something she hadn't earned. And somehow, I was the one she was jealous of. My parents had noticed it too, the anger that came from nowhere, the paranoia, the jealousy that attached itself to everything and everyone. At one point, they sat her down, gently, lovingly, the way only two people who truly care about someone can, and suggested she speak to a professional. Not because anything was wrong with her as a person, but because they could see she was still carrying something heavy. Something that had been sitting on her chest since she was too small to understand what it even was. They wanted her to heal. They wanted her to finally, after all these years, put that burden down. Betty didn't see it that way. The moment the words left my father's mouth, she shut down completely. She accused them of calling her crazy, of labeling her, of trying to push her away under the guise of concern. She said if they really loved her, they would just accept her the way she was, and that suggesting she needed help was just another way of telling her she didn't belong. My mom cried that night. My dad sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. They weren't trying to hurt her. They were worried about her. They could see what Betty could not, that somewhere inside her was still a little girl who never got to grieve what she lost, and that little girl had been quietly running the show for decades. But Betty refused, and so the wound stayed open. And the rest of us lived around it as carefully as we could. Now, before I get into what Betty did to me specifically, let me give you a little background on our girl. Consider this the highlight reel. She stole $20 from my mother's wallet once. Just took it. When my mom noticed and asked, "Betty, did you take money from my wallet?" My mom asked gently. "I needed it for something," Betty said flatly, like that was the most reasonable explanation in the world. My mom let it go, because that is who she is. Then there was the shoplifting. I still cringe thinking about it. Betty got caught stealing clothes from a store, and the next call my parents received was from the police. My dad and mom drove down there, paid for everything out of pocket, and begged the store not to press charges. "Please," my dad said quietly to the store manager. "She is family. It will not happen again. We will pay for everything." The store agreed. Betty walked away with a record and zero remorse. My parents walked away with their dignity barely intact. And if the stealing wasn't enough, Betty had a gift for something else entirely: spreading rumors. It didn't matter who. Aunts, uncles, cousins, their spouses, their neighbors, their coworkers. Nobody in the family was safe from Betty's mouth. She would take a small piece of information, add her own creative details, and pass it around like it was gospel truth. Marriages were questioned. Friendships were strained. Family gatherings got awkward because of things Betty said that had no business being said at all. People stopped inviting her to things, stopped sharing news with her, stopped picking up the phone when her name appeared on the screen. One by one, quietly, the family learned the hard way that whatever you told Betty in confidence was never truly safe. The woman was a one-person rumor mill. No subscription required. Oh, she got married once too. She was 22, his name was Dan, and honestly he seemed like a good man. Patient, kind, the type who genuinely tried. But Betty brought her jealousy into that marriage like a third person at the table, and it sat there at every single meal. Any woman who glanced in Dan's direction became a threat. She fought with coworkers, neighbors, strangers. It didn't matter. The final straw was Dan's boss, a 55-year-old grandmother who stopped him in the hallway after a meeting to say good job on a project. 10 seconds. Completely professional. Betty caused a scene in front of the entire office. "Who do you you think you are talking to my husband like that?" Betty snapped, getting in the woman's face. "Betty, she is my boss," Dan said, horrified. "I don't care who she is." Betty shot back. Dan filed for divorce shortly after and left the state. Not the city, the whole state. My parents were mortified, but they took Betty back in without hesitation, gave her her old room, and tried once again to help her get back on her feet. My mom sat with her on the couch, held her hands, and said, "Betty, we are here. We are always here. But you have to want to get better, sweetheart," my mom said softly. Betty cried and nodded and said she would try. She did not try. She just didn't. Now here is where things get personal. I want to be clear about something. I never provoked Betty. I never taunted her, never threw my life in her face, never once made her feel less than. I went to work, I came home, I minded my business, and I loved my family. That was it. That was the whole of my offense. But Betty had decided I was the enemy. And once Betty decides something, she commits. Dinner was a nightly performance. My mom would spend an hour in that kitchen cooking a full meal from scratch, and Betty would sit down, look at the plate, and sigh. "I don't really feel like this tonight," Betty said, pushing the plate away. My mom said nothing, just got up and made her something else. I watched my parents shrink around her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. My mom stopped humming in the kitchen. My dad started sitting at the table alone after dinner more often. They were tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. My parents sat her down more than once. "Betty, we love you," my mom said one evening, her voice gentle but her eyes heavy. "But you have to meet us halfway. We cannot keep doing this alone." "I knew you would say something like this eventually," Betty said, crossing her arms. "I knew one day you would make me feel like a burden." "That is not what we are saying," my dad said patiently. "It's exactly what you're saying," Betty snapped. "You have always favored Maddie. Everything is always about Maddie." I was sitting right there. I had not said a word the entire evening. My mom looked down at her hands. My dad breathed slowly through his nose, and the conversation ended the way those conversations always ended, with Betty retreating to her room and my parents sitting in the living room in silence. But Betty wasn't just difficult at home anymore. She had taken her campaign outside these four walls, and I was the target. It started with the reviews, strange one-star ratings appearing on my food truck page from accounts I didn't recognize, rude owner, terrible coffee, found something in my drink. I was hurt and confused because I put everything into that truck. Every early morning, every late night, every dollar I had. I knew it was her. The way she wrote those reviews, that's Betty's style. The shortcuts, the way she would say stuff, it's her. But I couldn't prove anything, so I kept my head down and kept working. Then the rumors started reaching people in the neighborhood. That my parents had funded the food truck, that I hadn't earned any of it. And then the one that stung the most, that I was drowning financially and performing success on social media while my business quietly fell apart. That last part came from me. From a private moment between two people who were supposed to be sisters. I had told Betty during one of our late nights that I was scared, that the loan payments were piling up and I didn't know if I was going to make it. I cried. She held me and said, "You are going to be okay, Maddie. I promise you are going to be okay," Betty said softly, and I thought she really meant well. 2 weeks later, she was telling anyone who would listen that I was failing. But even that wasn't enough. Then came Amanda. It was a busy Tuesday morning at the truck. Good music, steady line, the kind of morning that reminded me why I started all of this in the first place. I was pulling a double shot when I heard footsteps coming fast across the parking lot. "You!" Amanda shouted, pointing straight at me. "I know what you've been doing." The line went quiet. Every head turned. "Amanda," I started. "Don't Amanda me," she snapped. "I know you have been sleeping with my husband." I felt my face go hot. 30 people were staring at me. I set down what I was doing, slowly, and I stepped to the window. "Amanda," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could, "you and Tom are like family to me. Who told you I was sleeping with your husband?" "Someone told me they saw you together at a hotel," Amanda said, her voice shaking. I almost laughed. A hotel. I was at this truck at 5 in the morning and didn't leave until 9 at night. "Amanda, I live with my parents," I said evenly. I help pay the bills in that house. I am here before sunrise every single day. You know how old school my family is. Do you honestly think I could be doing what you're describing and still be standing here every single morning? Call my parents right now if you want. Call them." Something shifted in her face. "I am prepared to go to court to protect my name," I continued quietly. "But if you tell me who told you this, I will forget this ever happened. You have my word." Amanda looked at me for a long moment. "Betty," she whispered. "Betty told me. She said she saw you herself." The name landed somewhere in my chest and just sat there. I reached into the cooler and pulled out Amanda's usual order. Large iced coffee, extra oat milk, light ice. I held it out through the window. "Sit down," I said softly. "Cool off before you go home." "Maddie, I am so sorry," Amanda said, her eyes filling. "I should have come to you first. I don't know what I was thinking. She was so convincing and It's okay," I said. "You were scared. I understand." Amanda sank into one of the chairs beside the truck, staring at her cup. "You know how Betty is," I said after a moment. "Remember when she told everyone that Mrs. Andrews stole Mr. Frankie's roses?" Amanda looked up and, despite everything, let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "The woman had been growing those roses for 15 years, Amanda said, shaking her head. "Betty made a diagram of the fence," I said. We laughed, the tired, helpless kind, and then it faded. I went home that evening and sat down with my parents and told them everything. Every review, every rumor, every lie, Amanda, all of it. My mom covered her mouth with her hand. My dad sat very still for a long time. Then he looked at my mom, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words. He picked up the phone and called his oldest brother, Thomas. Now let me tell you about Uncle Thomas, because if you are going to understand why being sent to his farm was not a vacation, you need to understand who this man is. Thomas Whitaker is my dad's oldest brother. He lives on a farm in Nebraska with his wife Linda and their 3 children, Nancy, Warren, and Brandon. He is a pastor. He has never attended a family reunion, not because he doesn't love his family, but because the farm doesn't run itself, and Nebraska is a long drive. Instead, he would call my dad beforehand and say, "How much do you need for food?" Uncle Thomas asked simply. "Thomas, you don't have to," my dad would start. "How much?" Uncle Thomas repeated. And that was the end of that conversation. Money sent, family fed, no further discussion required. Nobody crosses Uncle Thomas. Not because he is loud or intimidating in the way you might imagine. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't make threats. He simply carries himself with the kind of quiet authority that makes people instinctively straighten up when he walks into a room. He is a good man. Deeply good. But goodness and softness are not the same thing, and Uncle Thomas has never confused the two. His family runs the same way. The farm wakes up early, and everybody wakes up with it. Everybody works. Everybody contributes. Nobody sits on the couch scrolling their phone while other people carry the weight. The complete opposite of everything Betty had been doing for the past decade. When my dad explained the situation, Uncle Thomas listened without interrupting. When my dad finished, there was a brief silence. "Send her to me," Uncle Thomas said. The trip was announced casually, a family visit to Nebraska. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Betty was told it was a week-long trip and she packed accordingly. 7 days of farm life, she could survive that. She had a whole plan in her head. What she didn't know was that the rest of us had a plan too. The drive from Chicago to Nebraska is about 9 hours, 9 hours of open highway and flat land, and Betty in the back seat thinking she was going on a family vacation. She complained around hour 3. "Are we seriously still not there yet?" Betty said, shifting in her seat. "Few more hours," my dad said pleasantly. "I don't know why we couldn't just fly," Betty muttered. My mom stared out her window. I stared out mine. My dad turned up the radio slightly. We arrived at the farm in the evening. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Linda welcomed everyone warmly. Dinner was on the table. Conversation was pleasant. Uncle Thomas asked Betty how she was doing and listened patiently while she talked, nodding along like a man with absolutely nothing up his sleeve. We planned to leave the next day. Of course, Betty doesn't know. By 9 o'clock, the house was winding down. Betty disappeared into the guest room, probably already counting down 6 more days until Chicago. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. We moved quietly, deliberately. Our overnight bags are already in the car the night before, while Betty was in the shower. My mom hugged me quickly in the dark hallway. My dad squeezed my shoulder. We walked out to the car in the early Nebraska morning, the air cold and clean and still, and we drove away without a sound. One night, 9 hours there, one night, 9 hours back. Betty thought she had 6 days left. Well, surprise, surprise. Uncle Thomas was already at the kitchen table with his Bible when Betty came downstairs. "Where is everyone?" Betty asked, looking around. "They went home," Uncle Thomas said, without looking up. Betty stared at him. "What do you mean they went home?" Betty said slowly. "Sit down, Bettina," Uncle Thomas said. "Breakfast is ready." "Did they leave me here on purpose?" Betty asked, her voice rising. Uncle Thomas closed his Bible. He looked at her with those steady, unhurried eyes, and he said, "Yes, now sit down." That evening at dinner was a conversation Betty was not prepared for. She had apparently decided she had been quiet long enough and made the mistake of opening her mouth at the wrong table. Something about not being treated fairly. Something about me. Something about the family never appreciating her. Aunt Linda set down her fork, folded her hands, and looked at Betty. "Betty, nobody in this family wanted to take you in," Aunt Linda said evenly. "You know why? Because you have been causing trouble for every single one of them for years, spreading rumors, getting people into situations they never asked for. I even heard you stole from a store, and your Uncle Bill had to go down there and pay for it himself." She tilted her head. "You cannot do any of that here." Betty opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Aunt Linda said pleasantly. Nancy went next without looking up from her plate. "The whole family knows what you did to Maddie," Nancy said flatly. "The fake reviews, the rumors, telling the neighbor lady your own cousin was sleeping with her husband. You have been doing this to everyone for years. That is why nobody raised their hand when they asked who would take you in. Nobody wanted the trouble." Warren was briefer. "You want to leave? Go ahead," Warren said, cutting his food. "But where are you going, Betty? Think about that before you say anything else." Brandon looked at her and said, "We all know everything," Brandon said simply, "just so you know." And then Uncle Thomas, who had been eating calmly through all of it, set down his fork and folded his hands. "Bettina," Uncle Thomas said, "I am not your Uncle Bill. Bill is a good and patient man, but that patience taught you there were no consequences for your behavior. There are consequences here. You do not follow the rules of this house. You leave. You disrespect my family. You leave. You cause trouble under my roof. You leave. But before you decide to leave, ask yourself where you are going, because we both already know the answer." He picked up his fork. "And if you feel like spreading rumors," Uncle Thomas added without looking up, "the cows are out back. Tell it to them. Maybe they will believe you." Aunt Linda covered her mouth. Brandon looked very hard at his plate. Nancy and Warren suddenly found their food extremely interesting. Betty had nothing to say. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Betty had absolutely nothing to say. "She called my dad that night. Is it true?" Betty asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "You don't want me back?" My dad was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm and tired and final in a way that Bill Whitaker's voice had never been before. "Betty," my dad said quietly, "we tried. For years we tried. We gave you every chance, every open door we had. You hurt this family over and over, and we kept letting you back in. We are done now. Not because we stopped loving you, but because we have nothing left to give." She tried calling other family members after that. One by one, they either didn't answer or said they couldn't help, because they genuinely couldn't and wouldn't, because Betty had made sure of that herself over many years without ever realizing it. Nebraska, or the streets. She doesn't have savings, no car, and definitely nowhere to go. She chose Nebraska. We found out what happened at that dinner table because Uncle Thomas called my dad and told him everything. Word for word. Within 24 hours, the entire Whitaker family had heard about it. Everyone heard. Everyone laughed. Not out of cruelty. Just the deep exhale of people who had watched this coming for a very long time and were finally breathing again. As for me, I was back at my food truck Monday morning, 5 a.m., same parking spot, same regulars. Same smell of espresso in the cold morning air. My parents came by Saturday like they always did. My mom rearranging my condiment station the way she always does. My dad sitting with his coffee and his newspaper looking like the most contented man alive. I still had my dream. I was still building it, one cup at a time. The cafe was still coming. I could feel it getting closer, the way you can feel a good thing on the horizon before you can actually see it yet. My dad looked up from his newspaper and caught me watching them. He raised his cup slightly in a small, quiet toast. I raised mine back. That was enough. That was everything. And somewhere in Nebraska, the roosters were crowing at 4 a.m. Betty was already up. She had chickens to feed, and the cows are waiting for her BS. I heard they're great listeners. Whether they believed her, though, that's between Betty and the cows. And that, my friends, is how you handle a sticky, sicky situation Whitaker style. This has been Melodic Vengeance. Like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed today's story. See you on the next one. Take care of yourselves.
If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Don't forget to follow for more content just like this. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.